going to turn off the chat box during the reading so that we have our attention to the readers. But then as soon as we're done with the reading, I'll turn it back on. Feel free to chat, but also feel free to stay and join us for a discussion. They've been really great. They've been really nice. I'm going to turn things over immediately to Linda Russo, who's our introducer today. Thanks, Linda.
Sure. Thanks, Cole. And thank you to the editors of this anthology, Mary Newell, Sarah Nolan, and Bernard Quetchenbach. And I also want to thank today's readers. I'm a contributor to this anthology, and I'm your host for today. So let me tell you a little bit. Poetics for the More Than Human World is an online anthology. You'll see the links in the chat. And it is set to appear in print later this year with Spuyten Duyvil Press. So it suggests an ecopoesis of relation to, for, within the more than human world. And just what that means has been a topic of discussion throughout these readings. So yes, there's going to be a discussion afterwards, and I encourage you to stick around for that. Echoing Cole. So today's first reader is Cara Chamberlain.
Thank you. I'm Cara, and wanted to thank Mary and Bernie and Cole for running the show, and all the poets and listeners. And just a couple notes about the poems I'm going to read, just really quickly. For some reason, I decided to write a poetic version of the periodic table. So that's what these poems are. I think I was interested in the names of the elements because they're so fabulous. And so I started writing acrostics, but changing what acrostic meant, playing with it. And then a student of mine got me interested a little bit in rap. And so I thought about the conventionality of rap combined with the creativity, and chemistry is sort of like that too. So what little I know of it. So this poem's in the anthology. It is based on a photograph by the great Florida photographer Clyde Butcher. And unfortunately, I'm not technically capable, so I can't project the image, but you can certainly look it up online. This is number 35, Bromine. By 2100, ocean will drown the keys, killing all sea-fringing, margin-adapted red mangroves of South Florida. In memoriam we'll have, if we have anything, if we are, old photographs, red mangroves by Clyde Butcher, for instance, that materialized in a dark room using perhaps photosensitive silver nitrate or bromide. In his image, the trunk of a single tree lunges open-armed over its own filigreed nematophores, a witch's tracery of bleached and bone-worn phalanges, edging into the water, the main trunk a contortionist tangle of spine and breast, black and white, and more exquisite for that. In the background, a silver-toned batik confusion of rangeless foliage, extended bolts of pattern, and the water a white-topped wash, satin smooth since the lens was open so long. Only a hint of a splash against the photo's vortex, which is located on what you could call the genitalia or seventh chakra of the tree, if you see it as somewhat human or lizard maybe, which it might be, judging by the rough and warty appearance of the bark skin mottled by accretions of moss or bromeliads and incrustations of tiny shelled creatures basking in a humid languor above the ocean. Its unrelenting battle against the land being waged right here on the battle-scarred old mangrove, forging its own offensive against the gently rising, if sly, incoming tide, warm and welcoming to the bonnet-head shark, grouper fry, trumpet fish, and other creatures of the wet, which, though well adapted, may not survive the rising nitrogen levels of our Anthropocene catastrophe, with which turquoise waters of the Gulf of Mexico darken even now, the red tides, a biblical scale plague of death and stench, causing respiratory distress in tourists whose vacation plans, alas, will degenerate into a week indoors at amusement parks and restaurants. Hog Heaven, for example, where silver look-down fish used to circle the pier like ponies at a carousel, and in all its rising horror, the coming in for good of the tides seems enough to remind me of dangerous bromine, blood brown, named for its stink and quick to emit potentially fatal vapors, an element that apparently has no completely safe applications, as the only thing makes it less awful than chlorine seems to be its propensity to exist at room temperature as a liquid rather than an infiltrating gas. And of course, I'm reminded when I think of these chemical dangers of the Aztec lords of Xibalba, the after-death kingdom, who have names like pus and flying scab, but who today could be called bromine, chlorine, uranium, and plutonium, and may only be defeated the way the twin heroes of the Popol Vuh won, which is by trickery and virtuoso dancing, as in Butcher's photo. And the next two are not in the anthology, but they're short, which you'll be glad to hear. And they're more familiar elements, perhaps. Number 6, carbon. Can't, won't stop writing about it. Artificial intelligence be damned. Just walking below, ruddy half moon at sunset. Great horned owl in skeletal tree. By foot and by pain, the long crawl toward home on the diamond edge of life. Aren't we all refugees? While the heron dips in sunset flame, nothing better to do, kneel and burn. And this is kind of a Montana poem where I live. I think it's pretty self-explanatory other than that. Number 30, zinc. Zach's played out, his women complain when he's made them hurt. In the bar, flashy with flat screen sports and hour after hour of Fox News. Nightly dips in the stock tank set up on the ridge keep him not too randy. He used to count all the stars like no one else on earth could even hope to. Zach says he's not played out. Things are mostly good. It's just the palladium mining lights. Shouldn't be that close. Left-leaning liberals' fault, notching up each bounty on his soul. Doesn't take a genius when night's not night, and can't you feel the hum of the pump jacks down the other way, humping like bucks? Zach runs his hand along the lip of the tank, the long, slow, cooling curve, imagining the lines of his lover's thighs, alone tonight. How does it happen? No one says you wouldn't be nothing without zinc, but that's actually the case, because ungalvanized, this human world would all be rust. Thank you.
And excuse me, there are some people who are not muted, and it may be that the automatic mute upon entry isn't working this week. It didn't last week. So if you could just double check, and if you're not the reader, make sure that your mute's on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Cara Chamberlain. Now I'd like to welcome, we have a collaborative or a pair reading together. And they are Andrew Melrose and Jen Web.
Hi. I'm Jen Web while Andy's unmuting, and I acknowledge that I'm speaking from Ngunnawal country. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And I think Andy's going to kick off the next bit.
Yeah, I'm going to introduce Jen Web is the Distinguished Professor of Creative Practice and Dean of the Graduate Research at the University of Canberra in Australia. Her research practice addresses creativity, representation, and material poetics. Recent publications include Art and the Human Rights, Contemporary Asian Context, the edited volume Publishing and Culture with D. Baker and D. Breen, and the poetry collection Moving Targets with the Recent Works Press, which is an Australian press. Her forthcoming collection of poetry is Flight Mode, which comes out in October 2020.
And I'll read Andy's bio note. Andrew Melrose is Emeritus Professor of Writing at the University of Winchester. He's the author of 32 books of scholarly and fiction. He's written and produced 15 films. He's a published poet. He's a published and pressed, I guess the term is, songwriter. And he created and wrote the forced migration project called The Boat, which was funded by the Arts Council of England. Most recently, he's edited my lovely journal, Axon Creative Explorations, the Journal of the Australasian Association of Writing Programs, which is Meniscus, and Writing and Practice for Norway. He's currently editing a prose poetry collection. And we had to do that because we forgot to get our bio notes in time. We're both members of a little collective called the Prose Poetry Project, which started in November 2014 when a bunch of us were away from home at a conference and we got bored during a session, so we started flicking little really short prose poems to each other, and from that it grew. There's about 27 members now across Australia, in the UK, Singapore, Israel. The logic of it is that we write fast, that we're allowed to steal each other's words, ideas, images. In fact, we call the other name for the project is authorized theft, because we do steal each other's work. The only rules are to write 3 pieces in the course of a year. Andrew was invited to join. He was one of the first international people invited to join a few years back. And since then, we've had a gradually expanding membership. And the poem that we'll read today is a product of that prose poetry project. Andy?
Yeah, one of the things that appeals to me about this poetry project is that I get up in the morning. I get up about 5:30, 6 o'clock UK time. Can you hear me okay, by the way? Yeah? Everybody here okay? And the Australians have been, had their working day. So Jen, this is Thursday for us, and this is my Thursday evening. Jen's already in Friday, so she can give us a report on whether the world's going to continue after you all go to bed tonight. So, which is interesting. But it's all, by the time I get up in the morning, they've already gone to sleep and their Friday's already gone. So it's really interesting to wake up in the morning and your inbox has got, it could have 5, 6, 10, loads of poems sometimes. Oz Hardwick from York writes a poem every single day, which is quite an extraordinary feat. And so we're going to read you 2 of the poems. This is one of the collections. This is called Pulse, Prose Poems, published by Recent Works Press. And I'm going to read you a poem from this, which I wrote, and then to show you how it knocks on, Jen's going to follow on with another poem. I wonder if, and just to explain this ever so slightly, that one of the things that Jen and I have got in common is that we both went to Robben Island in South Africa. So I wonder if there were wunderkammers on Robben Island, little boxes holding stories from across the water, treasures of soapstone figures and beads for braiding, a lock of a lover's hair, tiny scraps of paper with names and kisses, the letters themselves long disintegrated into feathery dust, or else confiscated, slivers of charcoal and chalk, maybe a pencil stub, a bottle top from the last beer before they shipped those boys out, shipping us in. On water matters matter more and more. In my Wunderkammer, I have a compass, just in case. Jen?
I first went to Robben Island when I was 8, so it was quite amazing to go back now that it's a beautiful museum. But you get there by taking a boat out. That's the only way to get there. So mine reads like this. We took the ferry from the harbour out towards Robben Island to see the brown seals that colonise the bay. The water was grey, the seas were high, where 2 oceans meet. where oceans collide. And this is not a metaphor. It is mere geography. The other kids turned green and leaned across the rails, ribboning vomit into the sea. The crew washed the deck with seawater, drenching our shoes. I was at home on the sea. I took out my brownie and snapped shot after shot of the silent rock ahead of us, seabirds whistling at its walls. The camera shook. The photographs failed. Now we shift on to the ECOPOETICS piece we did. We've been collaborating for about 10 years, but this is only the second or third collaborative poem we've written, so it was quite exciting for me. And we because of our interest in both poetry and phenomenology, we started this particular project by referencing the philosopher Simon Critchley. And he says, poetry describes life as it is, but in all the intricate evasions of as. The world that separates us is a world both seen and unseen until it's seen with the poet's eye. If a poet had said that, by the way, I'd think that was arrogant, but a philosopher said it, so it must be true. The world that separates Andrew and myself is 10,000 miles wide. Yet we cross waves and continents, hemispheres. We go north to south, south to north daily to converse like neighbors over the garden fence, swapping words, swapping poems, borrowing lines and phrases, sleight of hand, light of air asides, lost long lines, found lines, traces of thought and other interalliances come together in this eco-poetic exercise that blurs the lines between borders, gender, race, sexuality, days and nights. Our hours don't collide, but our words do. So it becomes his or hers or his, and then these are ours. From the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere, we join to produce a single poem. Andy?
And the poems are an equal collaboration between two writers who live in separate time zones, hemispheres and continents 10,000 miles apart, where, to quote Charles Taylor, what you get underlying a representation of the world, the kind of things we formulate, for instance, in declarative sentences, is not further representations, but rather a certain grasp of the world we have as agents in it. As members of the Prose Poetry Collective, we trade ideas, bounce off each other's poems and ideas, and allow the writing to collide and collapse into poems whose origins have become so blurred, they unsuppose a source and momentarily focus on the world in bewilderment. It is what lies between the forest and the sea. Jen?
The poem starts in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and Andy and I are going to just swap back and forth as we go. A path between primordial trees, a guide who is teaching us to name the trees and their tenants. Kakatia, he says, pointing. Totra. Between the giant Rimu and the Harakeki, we stopped to watch a kereru bathe, and then he was gone.
And you with him. The forest breeze green and slow, fantails whistled. I sat back against a tree and watched bracken trace my arms, fingertip mushrooms bloom bright across my belly.
By night, you had found me.
Among the quiet trees, less than memory, more than sigh. The stories they tell of fish all shining with life, whose lives they took gasping on a grassy hill.
The fish whose bodies they ate, white flesh searing silver in a pan.
The stories we tell of tails that burrow up from the earth, push through soil, up the trunks of trees, along the branches, then cling to leaves as they drop with the dew, or piggybacking seed pods, they slide off the edge of the cliff.
A clutch of broken vowels. Birds swoop to catch them in mid-flight and press them into the rock face, where they build small nests in patterns, like the pattern you traced in sand, a love poem, like the pattern we saw years later scratched into a Berlin wall.
You anchor me, it read. Your light as air asides dispel the despair of the world.
There are no anchors, only light. In early morning, we stretched out on the beach, making sand angels, while below the tide line, every 10th wave raked the sand, swirled empty shells. Later we fell asleep, bundled together, the sea black under a half moon. And when we woke,
flowers had woven around us, their roots tracing the blurred outline of our angels. Time to leave before the wind and waves took us. We ran ahead of a dreich, cold laced with damp till we were back among the trees, their leaves falling russet across a windfall.
keep up, you said, but then lost me in the Har as it rolled off the North Sea and across the coast. Dawn arrives early, a cacophony of seagulls, the cat crying at the door. Bees drone, pipes drone, and a drone whirs overhead, calling out to a bank of screens it cannot see.
For you I left the house, braved the morning and the sea, the breaking waves and the tempest that threatened to sink me.
Anchor me in your harbour. Let me feel the steady land under my feet and my life in your hand.
Now it's birds in the litter tray, fires at the front door, the racket of walls and cliffs and trees falling, and afterwards, just the sound of breathing in an empty room.
This is not the end.
Despite the lights out, gardens burned, boat holes closed.
Promise me it's not the end.
That's that.
And that is the end.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Andy, Melrose, and Jen Web. I'm still awaking from that dream. Our next reader is Eléna Rivera. Welcome, Eléna.
Hello. Thank you, Linda. I'm very happy to be reading in this series with so many fine poets, and I wanted to acknowledge that I'm reading from the unceded land of the Lenape tribe. And I wanted to start first by reading a poem by Bernard Noël, which is in the anthology that I translated. And I'm going to share my screen as I read the poem. Hopefully this works well. And it's from The Ink's Path. And this is from the 6th sequence this is a book-length poem. And it's number 3. But now that nonsense makes laws, what is the meaning of resistance when the poor are always poorer and the rich always richer? Poetry seeks to feel its way along its old subjects, then racks its brains. What was once promised lands is already no more than a paradise lost. Undoubtedly, we gain by putting ourselves in the middle of the present to challenge one's own desperation with sudden drafts of silence. We know we must sleep off the ashes, then grind the shadow to end. Each day, swallow the whole bitter thing to find that nothing is served by anger or revolt, not by one of these surges contrary to the times. And we must, in the very depth of the night, invent the survival of life, spit out the remains of rancor into the air while training for terror. No one knows just how much time remains of the future behind us. The present no longer knows how to go further than the immediate. Each touches in this extremity the edge of a condemnation. Is it to exile, to a detention camp, or to a common grave? We are standing under the menace that serves as the new sky. We forget azure beneath the sky and the pleasure of breathing. And then I'd like to read 2 fairly recent poems. The first one is called Drawn to Days as Numbers. Wilderness in the soul can promise assuagement, said the painter, instead of being drawn to numbers on a map. Darkness was light, and light, halation. On the map of her city, Forsythia carries into the future our present here. Azaleas, bleeding hearts, tulips, turn whirring, the act of shaking, into a green animal. Not to let fear get the best. Choke, an animal self in an apartment. A fly walks in zigzags. Here, nowhere to go. And then I'll end with this one. Loaded. The first sentence pulls the trigger with memories of certain pressures. Life lived in a compression of sorts. I identified with certain criteria. How to live in America depends on duration, the day, a name, one's space, not just personality. There's also one's looks, the owl in one's heart, where you were born. The population, unique parts, shades of the planetary make history, pass through. Mind entrained by jackhammers near the apartment. I forgot the sentence. The movement of trucks fixing roadways. There are many ways lives get minimized, hijacked by the violence of human experience. A harsh word scatters, a virus broadcasts, aggression internalized, a being split into parts, physical, mental, divorced from the light of pleasure. Summer wraps around resonances, the phenomena of power and resistance. Individuals struggle and want to identify with beauty and truth, each in their own way, in the minutes of their brief encounters. Time for cicadas and wasps in the city. Sensitive, I was called, naive, and not only because of the pace of the page, but the way I adapted easily to it. It matters what you fulminate about. Protesting for others, standing up for oneself. The moment is now vibrant and lucent. The mood, men, women, long for meaning, to touch, project themselves into time, to be loved as summer lengthens the days. We orbit around the sun. Come now, my love, my foe. Dear instrument, what is the mood this evening? Bodies and this phenomena of the mind. One has to imagine stillness, to rest in it, be in tune. Imperfect our paradise. Back to the first sentence. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eléna Rivera, and thank you for reading that poem from Bernard Noel. Thank you. Our next reader is Bradley J. Fest.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I want to quickly thank the editors of this anthology. It's truly an honor to be a part of it. Cole Swensen and everyone else involved in putting together this really wonderful reading series. I'm going to read two poems from my current project titled Post-Rock, in which I endeavor to perform what I'm calling a weird phenomenology, that is, seeing everyday objects anew by mediating their perception through lenses of poetic, environmental, and cultural influence. The first poem, Dead Horse Bay, also appears in the anthology and is about a bay outside Brooklyn, New York, in which they once threw the bones of horses made obsolete by automobiles, and which later became a massive dump that the rising tides are sort of slowly eating away at. Each poem in the project also contains an epigraph, including these two. And the first is from Jeff Vandermeer. Beetles and silverfish tended to those archives. I am aware that all of this speculation is incomplete, inexact, inaccurate, useless. If I don't have real answers, it is because we still don't know what questions to ask. Our instruments are useless, our methodology broken, our motivation selfish. Those various amber bleach bottles, those various equilibria of femtoseconds and gradations in yesterday's luminance were ground into revenant wind chimes by the rising waves, a calisthenics of moldering above calcimined skeletons, midden upon midden beneath a pile of new land slowly eroding against ancient flux, like your vision cauterizing promises to tomorrow's children about the destination of thin tires and braided rags, lonely shoe soles and graffitied boats, blue tickets and endless broken jars, flasks, decanters, Jeroboams, files, like your longing hanging suspended in the October dusk, precarious and wounded by the saddest relatability welling up from the sedimented refuse, a hypertrophic mania of forgetting. Looming metropolis, consider your depression and post-war magnificence amidst this vast buried collection, your discarded ramble, and then let the moment pass, as it always does. Clods of thrice dirty dust speculate about the invertebrate homes washed against your diminishing shore. Decrepit lean-tos and decaying washboards nuzzle against the beer cans and abandoned fire pits, brief hearths among what was never even ruin. These instruments without destiny, despecialized components thrown back into the hydrogen cast, exercise a weak force no longer capable of dissection or memory, just undigested pondering, a loose, indistinct song with every dynamic muted along easily numerable lines, perfectly crawling toward their anomalous topography, a breach in all difference, a glue for any future thought. And my second poem is forthcoming, I think this August, in an anthology called the Second Chance Anthology, which Variant Literature will be publishing. It's titled Blazon 3, and it also has an epigraph from H.D. Invasion of the oversoul into a cup, too brittle, a jar too circumscribed, a little too porous to contain the outflowing. In concluding one project with the instruction, take this cup, another herein takes shape. To take shape, I take to mean considering objects in space through the medium of language. To take a cup, I take to mean defamiliarizing it, attempting other poetic answers to my frequent opening pedagogical gambit. What is this? Why? But take? Nothing is taken. I take nothing. Nothing experiences itself as taken. There is nothing from which this can be taken. It remains often, always in hand or near to hand. When reading, writing, teaching, and the inner hidden dimension of everything, when the object is not actually present, not withdrawn, but attractively present as a virtual terminus, remains untouched, untaken. Nothing takes nothing. But have you perhaps, unbeknownst to me, already taken it before my own attempt to take anything even began? My own questions were already others, and will become others in turn. No matter. I simply cannot know the answer. But my own future potential ability to take I can plot, realize. I am my own terrible addressee, the worst possible outcome, the only intentionality that is predictable. Regardless, I have created a couple things. For their genesis, they don't seem taken from somewhere, unless language is a place, an object, something from which to take, something to take. The Oxford English Dictionary is a place. Bartlett's Roget's Thesaurus is a place, as is the Chicago Manual of Style, thesaurus.com, YouTube, Bandcamp. Whatever I'm taking, wherever I've taken what it is from, wherever I'm taking it to, don't depend on such spaces, do they? The taking occurs in non-geometrical space, does it? Language's spatiality is rather distant from the intimation of a totality. And why take? Does even this activity require yet another defense? Familiar polemics, tired arguments, endless repetition, take this, take it. This poetry has been taken, wrested, grabbed, held, seized, subtracted, drawn, carried, conducted, enchanted, etc., ad infinitum from something, surely. Or is it this thing, object, cup, from which poetry is taken itself? No matter. The taking has already occurred. There is no to, from. It is. It is too late. So take this cup at least one more time. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Brad Fast. Our next reader today is Petra Kuppers. Welcome, Petra.
Thank you, and thanks to Mary, Sarah, Bernard, and Cole so much for including me here. I'm so glad to be reading with you all. I am on Odawa land. I'll show you outside, the trees and the waters of Odawa land, part of the Three Fire Confederacy in up north Michigan, here, up north Michigan. I am German and I grew up there. Part of my culture was a deep entwinement of trees, language, movement, poetry. Germany is a perpetrator nation and a colonizer. And that tree connection that was so close to me was perverted in my history to terrible ends that still resonate through our racist world today. And to live within this heritage is in an ethical way, is part of my creative path. So here's my first poem. It is part of the collection. It was written as I was recovering from COVID-19, and it is written to a particular tree, to the white pine in my own garden. A friend had collected its needles and created a syrup, which I sipped for weeks to regain my voice and to calm my coughing. Dear white pine in my garden, thank you for the delicious syrup. Your 5 bundled fascicles cleave the alveoli of my lungs. Lances stir mucus, leave vitamin C in the brew. At the furthest end of my arterial capillaries, slick whiff of aroma lenses a molecule through the membrane's barn door. You lodge a mini tree in DNA passed down through my maternal line. Farm women with hands in faraway soil where what was wrapped in muslin sunk into tea kettles and boiled all day between Napoleon soldiers. Long treks to silk factories, hoot of Titanic engines on briny seas, mirrored itself in a new country, there grew wild and tall. We gather you now, new flu with old expectorants, ballast for the graveyards of our living rooms. Galleons come to a standstill. Oak timber decays into ribs on our beaches. Dear white pine, your soft wood smoothed the midships deck, salted and sugared. You dissolved first, fibers rent by seabirds. Leached out needles make for compost row. Acidic, you bite the land back, long for the sea, channel stuckness into flow. Protect us, dear white pine. Let me root here, back bowed, hands flat. Now, the second poem is part of my ecosomatic poetry collection, Gat Botany, just came out on March 3rd, right at the beginning of the pandemic, so not a good time to have a book debut. In the poem that I'm reading to you, I visited a young tree in our local botanical garden. I'm disabled, and it's not easy for me to stand up for any length of time. So this dance with the tree meant that I leaned on it. I held its smooth bark, gave it my weight, leaned away. The poem also has many eyes. And if you look at it on the page, it has all these little upright striving marks of forest strewn across the page. The poem is called Wind Tongue. I go blue, I drop out, I go, and I skirt school and work, and I run away, and I go. Forest, I won't, I shall not, and I leave now, and here I am, red cardinal pecks in the dirt far behind. Water rushes past sleeping snakes. Babe dragons with rattles that shake in the wind when they dry. Summer dreams deep beneath ice-cold water. Vernal peepers, North Face hikers. Canadian geese step into sweetly mown grass path. Verging along the river drops into black mud. Stiff on my cowboy boots, I tumble. Tree, wind, shake. Elasticity of the young snakeskin bark, tissue high and erect as I stroke it into a fit between softness of my palm and crocodile that rears along the way. Bits branch out and skewer. Eye poke, ear pierce, stumble and relax when I give my weight, when I give in, when I bow into you. And past spears, you echo, sway, far off cars meander through net, muscle flexed, cambium shaken, windstorm, memory, a scream near the nature center, kids spurt, tremble earth and bridge and mud on the path, where I try again, to try to reach to my childhood, play, to lean, to be all natural, open, to be open, to be, to live, to breathe, and to be, and to cycle through land and forest is open, is alive, is try, is bridge, is memory spur, is a spear, is an eye, and a socket, and a yell, and a muscle, and a bow, a weight, a tremble, a sleep, and a dark, dark wind, and a bridge, and a dark, and now it's too much, and it hurts, and I feel all the pinch, all pressure, all the leave it, and let it, and drop this, and why? So I sit down and write, palm tingling with a bark's rough tongue. Okay, for a last thing, I'll take you outside with me. Here we go. We're going out onto the deck. My dear wife, Stephanie, is opening this for me. So I lived for a decade in Wales. My own German heritage in my rural family background and sing to with trees. In particular, in my own practice, I open my airways, let vowel sounds travel, root, and connect. And I share now with you this practice as the end of my reading. Here's the tree I'm singing to. It's a hemlock tree. And I'll wait for a second to listen to the tree sing back. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Petra Kuppers. I think the audio cut out a little bit, but we can maybe in the Q&A, if people want to ask about if they missed something. I'd now like to welcome Arthur Z. Welcome, Arthur. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here reading with Cara, Andrew, Jen, Eléna, Brad, and Petra. Thank you, Linda and Cole, and all the editors of this great anthology for bringing us together. I'm going to share 3 poems from my book Sightlines, and the first one is in the voice of Lichen. It's called Lichen Song. Snow in the air. You've seen a crust on the ceiling wood and never considered how I gather moisture when you step out of the shower. You don't care that I respire as you breathe. For years, you've washed your face, gazed in the mirror, shaved, combed your hair, brushed out, while I, who may grow an inch in 1,000 years, catch the tingling sunlight. You don't understand how I can dive to a temperature of liquefied gas and warm back up, absorb water, start growing again without a scar. I can float numb in space, be hit with cosmic rays, then return to Earth and warm out of my sleep to respire again without a hiccup. You come and go while I stay gripped to pine, and the sugar of existence runs through you, runs through me. You sliver if you just go, go, go. If you slowed, you could discover that mosquitoes bat their wings 600 times a second, and before they mate, synchronize their wings. You could feel how they flicker with desire. I am flinging your words, and if you absorb, not blot my song, you could learn you are not alone in pain and grief, though you've instilled pain and grief. You can urge the dare and thrill of bliss if and when you stop to look at a rock, at a fence post, but you cough, only look. Yes, look at me now because you are blink about to leave. This next poem, which is in the anthology, is in the voice of Salt. And I taught for 22 years with Native American students at the Institute of American Indian Arts here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Salt Song. Zunis make shrines on the way to a lake where I emerge, and Miwoks gather me out of pools along the Pacific. The cheetah thirsts for me. And when you sprinkle me on ribeye, you have no idea how I balance silence with thunder and crystal. You dream of butterfly hunting in Madagascar, spelunking through caves echoing with dripping stalactites. And you don't see how I yearn to shimmer in orange aurora against flame. Look at me in your hand. In Egypt, I scrub the bodies of kings and queens. In Pakistan, I zigzag upward through 26 miles of tunnels before drawing my first breath in sunlight. If you heat a kiln to 2,380 degrees and scatter me inside, I vaporize and bond with clay. In this unseen moment, a potter prays because my pattern is out of his hands. And when I touch your lips, you salivate. And when I dissolve on your tongue, your hair rises. Ozone unlocks. A single stroke of lightning sizzles to earth. And I want to end by reading this last poem, which is called Talisman. And 75 years ago, exactly, the first atom bomb was ignited, exploded at White Sands, New Mexico, several hundred miles southeast of Santa Fe. Talisman. Quetzal. You write the word on a sheet of paper, then erase it. Each word, a talisman, leaves a track. A magpie struts across the portal and vanishes from sight. When you bite into sea urchin, ocean currents burst in your mouth. And when you turn, view the white shutter to the house up the canyon, a rainbow arcs into clouds, expectancies, fears, yearnings, hardly bits of colored glass revolving in a kaleidoscope, mist rising from a hot spring along a river. Suddenly, you are walking toward Trinity site, searching for glass and counting minutes of exposure under the sun. Suddenly, small things ignite. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Arthur Z. So, who would like to open up some discussion today?
Well, I'm going to start just with an observation that the entire reading today I thought was really interesting in terms of the more than human subtitle of the anthology. It seemed like there were so many interesting ways of overflowing the human, the trees, and Arthur, your project with the voice of various things, Elena's owl in the heart, and Andrew and Jen's way of moving out into specific spaces and focusing on the overflow there, the phenomenology. And I just wondered if any of the readers wanted to speak about that sense of overflow, what that going beyond the human, how that operates in their work, and what their thoughts are on that.
Okay, Cole, I'll respond, or I'll start. I loved how various the readings were. And for instance, Petra's invocation poem to the white pine tree. I just think it's like this organic web. You know, none of us predetermined. I had no idea what the other readers were going to read, but as I was listening, I felt like this web being formed that was more than human. So it was not just people in conversation, but people in nature and sort of beyond the human, so that it's part of this one large ecosystem. So I felt like it was organically happening during the process of the reading, unfolding. And I really loved that about the event this afternoon.
Maybe I can just carry on. About 15 years ago or so, I read that scientists had been doing experiments on fruit flies, as they always do. And what they discovered was that fruit flies' brains respond like ours do. They store memory in the same way. They have fear and delight in the same way. And since then, it's been very difficult to think of humans as being different in any way from amoeba and fruit flies and elephants. And so I love the idea of beyond the human, because it's a recognition that we are just living beings in a universe of living beings. And poetry can do that.
Yeah, and here's Petra. So I agree with Arthur and Jen both. I mean, this web that we're creating was gorgeous. It was amazing when Cara started out with the mangrove and this beautiful woven poem of the mangrove and its multiple accretions and the water it stands in, that the elemental interweaving, I felt was just, it was such a gorgeous beginning for all of us to weave ourselves into. Yeah. And the other question that you had, Cole, was to me, I also heard it as, how do we have space for the not other than human to be part of our creation, right? Not just as something to write about, but to write with. And that is, to me, a really important and interesting question, how we sit with and sit by the much longer durations, the different kind of time frames of the entities that we are engaged with. So I don't know whether you were actually able to see. I saw my internet was going unstable. When I went out to the hemlock, I'm hanging out with that hemlock and I'm doing that, singing to it quite a lot. Andrea Henge, who's actually, she's, I think, Andrea, you're on here in this, she does moss dancing. And I did this as a preparation. I didn't have too much time this morning, but I popped in. Someone said here, can you describe the singing to the trees? So yeah, I just sing with, my mouth is open. I'm trying to think about the openness of the tube here, and I sing vowel sounds to the tree. And the moss dancing that we did with Andrea earlier this morning was about thinking about moss and substrate, thinking about our body on the surfaces that we're on and how our surfaces our body infiltrates like moss, how we can be with. So this is a long, convoluted answer, but to me, there's something about spending time and getting our bodies involved in other entities. And then that moment of listening is really important to me.
I want to pick up on your comment, Petra, and connected to Jen Webb's comments on collaboration, which I thought were really interesting in the way that you spoke of it as not just two distinct entities collaborating in the usual sense, but actually a kind of erosion of boundaries there. And that seemed to me also to be a theme that ran through today and much of the work that's been done that we've heard in the idea of a collaboration with, for instance, the elements of the periodic table. They're always collaborating with us and with each other, with the various animals that came in. And I wondered if anybody wanted to speak directly to that notion of collaboration in a larger sense than it's usually used.
Well, I was thinking about Arthur's poem with the salt, and how salt is such a sensory experience for humans, and I imagine for all animals and plants, and it's so basic, and it's hard to say that we're separate from it because it's also in our bodies. So I find that it's hard to tease out the individual, and I think it was interesting that so many people mentioned the land they were on and the history of it. I mean, where I live, it could be Lakota, it could be Crow. I mean, so many people came through the Yellowstone Valley, but I think sometimes, I mean, like Andy and Jen, questioning where an individual starts and ends, and maybe there is no start and end, and we're all connected, and I don't know, it kind of, everything today connected to. So maybe this is a rambling comment, but I find that we seem to all be trying to get away from the individual and thinking about systems.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Please.
Oh, just one thing I think that to add to what Cole was asking, I felt a marvelous sense of humility running through the readings today. A kind of humility that allows for that collaboration that seems like a melding, that allows for that presence of the other that's not just the speaker of the poem, in the work. And I just really wanted to thank you for that. I thought it was stunning.
Yeah, Cole, to answer your question toward collaboration, I guess for myself, the poems that I've been writing, I recently moved to Oneonta, New York, which is in rural upstate New York, and I grew up in the suburbs and in large cities, somewhat large cities, and so this move toward places where the air is very fresh and everything is very green or very cold during the winter has been, the place is inflecting the language and the language is trying to capture the place. And so Dead Horse Bay is obviously not in upstate New York, but in terms of the more than human or the way that the human can transform and get in a feedback loop, one of the most striking things about Dead Horse Bay is that you can see as the waves are eating away at the landfill, you can see the past, or at least the discarded remains of the human past. And there's just rags and old tires and all this, from the 30s and 40s. Clorox bleach bottles, the old glass kinds. And there's so much glass that's been ground up in the waves that the waves actually tinkle with little, it's like, makes like a little sound. And it's beautiful, that sound. But it's also horrifying just to see the amount of stuff that humans have put in the ground and how much the waves are rising because of human activity. And those rising waves are eating away at the ramel and the trash and the detritus of the past, and then becoming tinkling waves. And then here you are, a sort of 21st century subject, knowing the future is very bleak and seeing the cause of it. How do you channel that into language? What does that language do? How does it get back to the beyond the human? I find it very hard to think through what poetry's role in exploring that intersection between the human and the non-human, the beyond the human thing is. But that's what I try to do in my work, I suppose.
I'm trying to leave room for other people to respond as well, but that's an amazing image. And this kind of sense of going back in time through ecological destruction. It's really, really powerful.
I think one word I want to throw out there, continuing thinking about the collaboration is, reciprocity and, trees just being this marvelous, physical example of reciprocity. Breathing, we breathe with trees, they breathe with us. And Ghazal had mentioned in the comments here about the moment we were waiting for the tree to respond for Petra, and the response to the tree was powerful. Camilla Nelson also does a similar practice and leads writing with tree workshops, which, I do as well. And the trees, Jonathan was working with trees yesterday. I watched it yesterday, it was last week. So if I was kind of to spin this, I just wanted to observe that. I think that's really powerful and beautiful. And I know I'm leaving things out, the lichen song, Arthur's lichen song, sugar of existence runs through you, runs through me, the cambium shaking in Petra's tree. So if I was to wind this into a question, no pressure to answer, but I was really struck by the idea of eco-collaboration that Andy and Jen, talked about. And I don't know, eco-collaboration is kind of like putting things together, for me, helped all this other stuff spin out. What do you guys think of eco-collaboration, if it had to be a question?
I think eco-collaboration is great. I think it's a great word. It's a great way of doing things. I mean, it's a sensory opening. It's a somatic opening. What does it mean to be vulnerable, penetrable to human cultural pasts, human cultural presence, to concrete, to trees, to urban and rural spaces? And I think that the thought practice of vulnerability and penetrability, of responsibility, is to me at the heart of that collaboration. Whether I'm collaborating with other humans, whether I'm collaborating with other entities. Again, breaks, breathing, being with, even the collaboration of this beautiful web here. I mean, I just love seeing all these faces here on the screen. I mean, just because this is electronic doesn't make it any less meaningful to be with one another. So I just want to once again shout out to Cole and Charles and everybody else, and of course our editors who who bring us together in this way. It's just delicious to be able to hear our voices weave together in this way, even if we're not together. I would love to be together, but this is also fabulous, and this is also a form of eco-collaboration. So thank you for allowing us to do this.
Petra, my cat is trying to climb through the screen to meet you. So
I would love to see that.
At one point, Petra, you talked about vulnerability, but one of the phrases we used in the introduction was bewilderment, and thinking about the bewilderment that lies between the forest and the sea, and the idea that you know, as people who've lived on the earth a long time, but we really don't know as much as we think we do sometimes, or many, you know, much of the time. So the bewilderment is something that we constantly explore in the Prose Poetry Project. When somebody will drop a line on you or drop an idea, and then you'll develop an idea and work from somebody else's perspective. Or when Jen and I were working together, and we were knocking ideas and words back and forward. We weren't really, there was no discussion. You know, Jen wouldn't say, "What did you mean by that line there?" There was no kind of discussion with that at all. She would just take something and move it, and I would take something and move it. And when we put the whole thing together, we had a look at it to see if it made any sense, and then we chopped it up to read it, and realized it made a lot of sense, because we were still trying to deal with the bewilderment of the, you know, or the 10,000 mile separation in a kind of in an eco collaborative way. So, and we do that a lot. I mean, you know, sometimes these prose poems arrive in our inboxes daily. So we're collaborating all around the world. And there are probably people on this feed at the moment who are involved in it as well. So it's an interesting a way of working as well, to to think about the idea of bewilderment, because Australia is a strange place. If you've never been there, it's a wonderful place to go to. And America, I've been in Montana. It's great to see Cara and Bernie. I can see you on my screen. It's great to see you both again. Hi, how are you? And it's a long time since I've been in Montana, but I had a wonderful time there. But Montana's not Winchester, where I work, or Brighton, where I live. It's a different place from the UK, and different time zones as well. I'm just it's 10:05, and I haven't had a beer yet. You know, it's in the evening, so whereas Jen's getting ready to go for her breakfast on Friday. You know, she's already in Friday. You know, so
7 a.m. and I haven't had a glass of wine yet.
Well, that's unusual for you, Jen.
I just want to second the idea of bewilderment. I think it's so crucial as an artist, as a writer, as a poet, and also as a reader, that because if you have, or if you start reading a work, or if you start creating a work, and you have to struggle with that bewilderment, then you can't really, you don't know where you are. You have to look with fresh eyes. You have to, instead of, when you don't know where you're going, discovery and all kinds of discoveries become more possible. So it's also, in terms of, to expand it with a kind of eco-poetic point of view, it makes the text porous and makes the self creating the text porous, and makes reading, the experience of language, porous. And bewilderment, I think, is really a crucial step toward re-envisioning, reconfiguring, understanding the world in a new and deeper way. So I applaud what you just said.
And I'd like to applaud what Arthur just said. I think that was brilliant, perfect. And the only thing I have to add to it is, when the opposite happens, when you're not bewildered, when you think you know, that's when you make boring work, or that's when, as a reader, if I sense that the writer thinks they know all the answers and I'm reading a poem, that's when I turn off. completely.
I like the fact too that the bewilderment just is such a packed word. It's got wild in it, which makes me think of Thoreau in Wildness is the Preservation of Life. And it also includes the injunction to be wilder. So a word that wants to unpack itself. But I was also thinking too, throughout the now 4 readings that we've done, the notion of unknowing as an active process. And I think it was Jonathan Skinner who last week spoke directly to this idea that to unknow as an active mode of involvement with the world.
I think it starts over a century ago too, with, or much more longer, but Keats particularly articulating that in the letter to his brothers, about being in radical uncertainty, radical doubt, not reaching for the answers, but being allowing yourself to be confused and uncertain. And in that, stuff happens. Because if anything could happen, it probably will.
And also that sense of that word bewilderment, but also that existing in unknowing, I often associate with HD, who Brad invoked in a epigraph today. And that possibility of, that's the only possibility of getting to places that you never knew you could get to, and you never knew the reader could. Not that those need be the same. A reader may take something quite different away from it.
I was thinking, this is Jonathan, bewilderment also has beside, to be beside something. And so I was struck at the voicing, the different voicings, the variety of voicings. And I was wondering if there's a way in which one is beside one's voice in this, if there's a kind of writing that's being practiced here. I mean, I could ask any of the writers, what is the voice of salt, Arthur? Does one write beside, does one stand beside salt to let, I mean, because the human voice is, it's there. We can't just, like, I think Alice Notley once said, you can't make the I go away just by suppressing the first person pronoun. It's still, the self is still there. The voice is there. So how do we stand beside the voice? Right beside the voice.
I wanted to thank everyone. That was beautiful. It was really engaging and inspiring reading, and all different kinds of sounds and voices coming through. I wanted to just say a few things about, I think this discussion is really interesting about vulnerability and collaboration, vis-a-vis collaboration with the non-human world. And as poets, that idea that you're talking about speaking aside, what is the voice of salt? I'm thinking about, I have been thinking about a lot of those things. Like one thing is, of course, attentiveness. Arthur's poem about the mosquito, that's very precise information about that being, and how we as poets, not only the first step, of course, is attentiveness, attending to, through your senses for what you see, but also that vulnerability in that you have to believe that you can speak with them, as Petra do. How do they speak back is a whole conversation about consciousness. Do you just listen as we listen to the tree, but also the idea of image being able to be taken inside us and start speaking to us over time. The poem speaks to us and the image speak to us, not just for that moment, but that night in our dreams, or next week when someone says something to us, we get a more thorough understanding of what that being is trying to say to us. And that's vulnerability, because you're going to sound a little crazy, right? To say that. And so, but how do we speak to non-language speaking beings? The image is one way to do that. That's why I love the idea of HD. And who worked a lot with, I'm going to just throw this word out, with that multiple subjectivity, to thinking about the poem being able to hold many voices within it where you're not quite sure, you are bewildered. Is the tree speaking? Or, you know, when she says, whirl up, sea, whirl your pointed pines, crash your pointed pines on our rocks. You know, is HD speaking, or is the Oread speaking? And so those kind of things are it's making me think of all those things in hearing your poems. So thank you.
I wouldn't mind responding just because a couple people mentioned the HD epigraph. That poem comes from a series. It's not exactly eco-poetic. I'm calling them blasons, which is an older form of like meditating on anatomy, but I'm not doing that. I'm really just trying to write a bunch of poems about this particular cup. And what I found in terms of speaking is that it's a exercise in, you know, phenomenology of the subject, the consciousness encountering the object, and I can't, you know, bewilderment, but also humility before the object. You can't ever describe it or get it or represent it. And so the poems that kind of emerge are these assembled speakers, where the object, whatever that thing beyond the human, beyond the subject, beyond the consciousness, beyond the I, is speaking, because it can't not, and it keeps speaking over and over and over again in every different poem and in lots of different ways. And of course, the human is there sort of trying to, you know, voice that assemblage the best that they can. But I'm increasingly thinking that the idea of some kind of coherent I is always this multiplicitous, assembled, contingent, localized historical thing that's a total collaboration of whatever the poet is looking at, and its attempt to assemble a voice to speak that coalescence.
In that context, I thought that Petra's movement from an I that's scattered all over the page, which is the writer's I, but she also said it creates a forest on the page. And then, of course, the page is made of paper, is made of trees. And then she walks out the door and sings to the tree. I thought that sequence was really wonderful. And then just a second thing, I wanted to give a little call out to Eléna Rivera writing a very urban poem, because one thing I value about ecopoetics is it's gotten away from, it must be so-called nature. You know, the entire world is its substance, and urban experience is incredibly important. And just I was taken when she wrote of an animal self in an apartment. And of course, this moment of animal selves and humans and urban nature and viral nature being so much apart. So I really appreciated that, Eléna, that moment.
Thank you. I'm a little late on my pick here.
Sure.
Thank you. Yeah.
I like, Eléna, I wrote down your line about shaking into a green animal. I thought that was really beautiful. A lot of shaking in these poems, now that I think about it. I want to ask you about, could you say a little bit about the Bernard Noel poem that you chose to share?
Yeah.
A line I pulled out is, what is the meaning of resistance? And I think that's really interesting here too, because you can't collaborate, you know, where is resistance in collaboration? We talked about vulnerability. But yeah, tell us a little bit.
Well, this is one part of a book-length poem, all in 7 parts, all with 15 lines each book, called The Ink's Path. And Bernard Noel, who's turning 90 this year, originally was writing a lot in his horror at the Algerian War, and did a lot of different things. He's written prose and poetry, different things. And I think at this point with Chemin d'Encre is very, it's a poem that goes through different stages, but where he actually didn't even really want to finish the last section of it because he felt like it was just going towards death. And for him to see everything that has happened in his long life, he really feels like, I think, that humans have made a mess of things, at least in France, on his perspective. And so, though I can't speak for him, but that's a little bit of what he's told me. And now I forgot your question. But to answer, I guess, that question of collaboration, translation is a really intense collaboration because you really need to, I realized translating the poems that I was writing, his poems. It's kind of a strange thing to explain about how a translator it's a little bit different with poetry than prose because it's the language itself and you are making the poem. And it's not the story. It has to be a poem in the French. And so you end up having to kind of enter the world of the writer in a way that ends up being very collaborative, that ends up being where you don't really know who is what, where, anything like that with translation. And we're always trying to translate ourselves and our environments, as well as taking them in. I don't know, I'm not speaking very coherently, but I do think, yeah. Yes, Cole.
Oh, I was thinking about the collaboration. What's peculiar about translation as collaboration? I was thinking about that the fusion. It's clearly not a fusion of identities, but it is somehow a fusion of voice that throws a spotlight on the connection between voice and identity, I think.
Yeah, because it's not at all the personality, but it's to get into the language or the space of the poem. Yeah.
I'm wondering, for people who are more isolated or more in the city at this point, how the experience of isolation relates to interconnectedness and also, to scale. I mean, many of you have talked about vulnerability, so I think that the pandemic brings in that micro scale, right, for everyone, but how does sort of isolation and interconnectedness play off of each other? I think, does one become more aware of certain kinds of dependencies on air, et cetera, in this circumstance?
I think I've mostly become aware of how difficult it is not to be close to other human beings, especially as with the opening up in Australia. We're going out and we're kind of bumping up against people and thinking, we've got to stay 1.5 meters, 2 meters away from each other. And yet the thing that has become natural to a lot of us is to embrace our friends and colleagues as we see them. to queue close to other people, we now realize that each of us is an enormous threat to the others. And so there's a strange, it's connection and disconnection at once, a real a sense of deep tenderness towards others and yet resistance as well. So that's been my little tiny experience in this not very locked down part of Canberra.
I remember a similar thing. I was at the University of Sussex a while back, and I don't know if anybody's ever come across the works of Alan Sinfield. And in those days, Alan Sinfield was setting up a course on gay theory and the likes. And he said, I can remember him saying, round about the time where AIDS was discovered for the first time, HIV, and he said, I don't know what's happened to the world. He said, I just went about my business being a normal gay guy. He said, now everybody wants to hug me. And it was a kind of strange dichotomy about, you know, a previous pandemic type situation, if you like, and now we have this kind of. I think everybody was trying to show some kind of acceptability. At that, what he was trying to say was that I'm just everybody wants to hug me now, where previously they just let me get on with my business, and now I think we feel the same thing now. We can't, communicate in a way which we've become used to over the last 20, 30 years. I mean, I don't know. I think that's part of it. Well, I come from a culture in Scotland where if your father shook your hand, that was about as close as you got to intimacy with a parent. And now 50 years later, it's something that I took for granted. You take for granted. So there is a new kind of bewilderment there, isn't there? In that way, there's a kind of a distance. Having spent years getting closer together, now we've become more distant again.
Yeah, I remember a moment in one of Edwin Torres's readings a little while ago, when Jennifer Bartlett spoke about a different facet of isolation in relation to poetry worlds, and one that I'm thoroughly echoing. Because I don't live in Brooklyn or in San Francisco anymore, these Zoom meetings are so de-isolating, because I can be part of readings even though I'm a disabled woman that lives in a rural part of the US. It still seems amazing to me that I'm reading with Jen. I last saw in Australia. It's amazing. And that Jonathan, whom I see at conferences maybe in the US, but usually also only in Britain. So that sense of, I don't know about you guys, but for me, I get to more readings. I get to listen to more readings, and I also get to be in more readings now in viral times than I would do otherwise. We have a local pub down in Ypsilanti, and we do readings there that has a proper stage and nice red and green disco lights, and we have punk readings there, which is super fun, and we love it. I really miss that. But that's very different from these kinds of readings, where even right now we still have 35 people here. To me, rural and disabled, this is not normally available. So, Mary, this is a great question, and
you can get
I love
in the
it.
door.
I can get in the door. That's the other thing.
Poetry
Thank you, Stephanie.
Petra can't get in the door.
Excellent point. I'm coming with my little scooter, right? My wheelchair, my scooter. I can't get in the vast majority of the bookstores, where the normal readings take place. I can't get in those damn things. So doing it like this allows me to be with you all, and I am so grateful for it.
Yeah, I think it's wonderful to see everybody. It's also nice to do a poetry reading in bare feet. So I usually haven't done that. But when people are talking, it makes me it makes me think that language is the root of, route, ROUTE, of migration between people, and it's the exploration. And even if we don't have the sensory touch, we can at least use language. And I think getting away from the ego, I had a guitar teacher who told me once you start thinking you're playing well, you're going to mess up. So you let the language run through you, and that's where we make those connections with each other, with the non-human elements, whatever there is in the world. And so I sometimes think language is a barrier because it's hard to work with, but it's also the thing that connects us. And so these readings are, I think, really great because it is language migrating everywhere across the world and between people. So, thank you all.
I think, of course, it's true that it's the language, but don't you feel it also depends on the practices that we each do when we're not together? You know, you've each talked about that in different ways, how you invite various ways of being connected to the non-human world. And I think otherwise our language would be very much more shallow, you know, than it is in this context. So some of you have spoken about that, and I think it's important. I'd love to hear about more how you make yourself more available for the more than human world. Jonathan talked last week about forest bathing, for instance, and many of you have brought up specific things.
This is very specific, but I grew up in southern Arizona in the Sonoran Desert, very dry, and I'm very familiar with the vegetation there, but upstate New York, not so much. And I realized a couple years ago, there's so many poems filled with flowers, and there's no flowers anywhere in my poems because there's not a ton of flowers in the Sonoran Desert. A few, on saguaro and stuff like that. But I don't know any of the normal flowers, so I've really given myself over to trying to learn about flowers and stick them in my poems where I can.
Yeah,
I love that.
Another teacher. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say I really loved hearing Andy and Jen, collaborate across space. It made me think of Pauline Oliveros's, she called teleconcerts. I think she sort of pioneered this technological form of interaction across technologically aided musicking across vast spaces. But what occurred to me was that, also hearing Cara's periodic tables and Eléna, just bringing me to New York and Brooklyn and the jackhammers and the fulminating, the mattering of the fulminating, and Bradley, it's interesting. Brooklyn, place I know, but also interesting to hear you being from Arizona. And there's Charles there, in Arizona, and Petra in the Michigan Peninsula, and then Arthur. Haven't seen you in so many years, but you're in New Mexico. I know that landscape. So these geographies are being vehicled through the voices. So there's a kind of telegeography here as well, and that's which is, as you said, Mary, depends on the practice, the offline practice. But it's an interesting kind of uncharted geography that is created here. It seems to me.
Okay, cool. It does feel like the geography really influences the writing and what is made possible by surroundings and by what we live with daily all the time and what we notice. Sometimes it seems incredible to see, the same tree every day, but because it's there, it's singular, and there's not like tons of it. You really notice it. You go, oh wow, there's that tree. Oh, it's looking this way today, or that way. It changes a little bit, and you can't help but be influenced by what the environment's, how it feeds you, and I don't know, it seems like in the city, it's like a kind of compression of it all, you know, where there's so much that you can, that is affecting a person when they're, I mean, for me, when I'm writing, it really does play a part. And I hear that in all the other pieces as well. And I think a lot of times, oh, if I was here, I wonder, you know, what would come out, you know, that would be really interesting. And so, anyway.